Eleanor Whitmore felt the cold stone against her shoulder before she even understood what had happened. One moment she was being led through a hall filled with white roses and golden light, and the next moment, a woman in a gray uniform was pointing her toward a chair tucked behind a thick marble pillar, so far from the altar that she could barely see past the stone. Eleanor blinked, certain there had been a mistake. She looked down at the small card in her hand, the one that had arrived at her door 3 weeks earlier, with the Ashford family seal pressed into the wax. It read her name clearly, Table 12. But when she reached Table 12, she realized it was not near the front, with the other guests who mattered. It was pushed into a shadowed corner, half hidden by stone, as if someone wanted her to be there and not be seen at all. She sat down slowly, smoothing the folds of her pale blue dress, the only formal dress she owned. Around her, laughter and music drifted from the grand hall of Ashford Manor, but here behind the pillar, the sound felt distant, like it belonged to another world. Eleanor pressed her lips together and told herself it did not matter. She had not come for a seat of honor. She had come because Alexander had asked her to come, personally, in a letter written in his own hand. "Do not miss my wedding, Eleanor. You above anyone deserve to be there." Those words had made her chest ache, with a strange mixture of joy and sorrow, because she had once believed there could be more between them than an old, complicated history. But that was long ago, and she had learned to keep such feelings folded away, tucked deep where no one, not even herself, would look too closely. A young woman glanced over from the neighboring table and gave a curious look, taking in Eleanor's simple appearance, her worn shoes polished to a shine that could not hide their age. Eleanor smiled politely and looked away, choosing instead to study the enormous chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, each one dripping with crystal that scattered rainbows across the marble floor. Ashford Manor was the grandest house she had ever stood inside, with towering windows that looked out over acres of green lawn and a lake shimmering in the afternoon sun. She had grown up only a short walk from these gates, in the small cottage where her mother had worked as housekeeper for the Ashford family for nearly 20 years. Eleanor knew every hallway of this house, every creaking stair, every secret garden path, though she doubted anyone here today would believe that a woman in a simple blue dress had once run barefoot through these very halls with the young heir to the entire estate. She thought of Alexander as a boy, quiet and serious, always carrying a book under his arm, always searching for a place where no one would ask anything of him. He used to hide in the old library on the east wing, where his father's portrait hung above the fireplace with stern eyes that seemed to follow him everywhere. Eleanor had found him there once, curled into a window seat, and instead of leaving him alone as any other child might have done, she had simply sat down beside him and started reading her own book in silence. That was how their friendship began, without grand words or dramatic gestures, just two children finding comfort in shared quiet. Over the years, that quiet friendship grew into something steady and true, a private world that belonged only to them, hidden from the sharp eyes of the Ashford household staff and the even sharper judgment of Alexander's father. The murmur of voices pulled her back to the present. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, offering her a glass of sparkling water, and Eleanor accepted with a quiet thank you. She noticed a woman standing near the head table, dressed in deep emerald silk, directing the final placement of chairs with sharp, precise gestures. That was Margaret Bellamy, the bride's mother, a woman whose reputation for control and calculation had reached even the modest corners of the village, where Eleanor now lived. It did not take much imagination to guess who had decided where Eleanor should sit today. She had heard whispers, faint and careful, about how Margaret had reviewed every single guest list herself, crossing off names and rearranging tables with the precision of a general planning a battle. Eleanor supposed she had simply become an inconvenient name on that list, someone whose closeness to the groom did not fit the story Margaret wanted the day to tell. Eleanor looked down at her hands folded in her lap and reminded herself, gently, that she had not come here to be noticed. She had come because Alexander deserved to have at least one person in this grand hall who remembered him before he became a duke, before every word he spoke was measured for its political weight, before every smile was calculated for the newspapers that followed his family's every move. She had come because somewhere beneath the title and the wealth and the expectations, there was still the boy who used to sneak into the kitchen at midnight to steal warm bread from her mother's oven, laughing quietly so the housekeeper would not hear him. A soft voice broke through her thoughts. "It's a bit of an odd spot for a seat, isn't it?" Eleanor turned to find an older woman settling into the chair beside her, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a small feathered hat. The woman introduced herself as Beatrice, and something in her calm, warm expression reminded Eleanor instantly of comfort, the kind found in old friends rather than new acquaintances. Eleanor admitted, with a small laugh, that she supposed the view from behind a pillar was not exactly the best in the house. Beatrice's eyes sharpened with interest, though her tone remained gentle. "And how do you know the groom, dear?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "My mother worked for his family for many years. Alexander and I grew up together, in a manner of speaking." Beatrice studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she simply nodded and said, "I see," in a way that suggested she understood far more than her simple words revealed. Around them, the ceremony space was filling quickly. String musicians tuned their instruments near the front, their soft notes rising and falling like a rehearsal of the emotion that was soon to come. Guests in fine clothing filed into rows of white chairs, decorated with ribbons and small clusters of flowers, laughing, greeting one another with practiced warmth, the sort of warmth that only existed among people who had spent their lives moving through rooms exactly like this one. Eleanor watched them with a quiet, careful distance, aware of how different she looked in comparison, aware of how her hands, still faintly roughened from years of honest work, did not match the smooth, manicured hands of the women around her. She thought again of the letter Alexander had sent her, and the words that had convinced her to come despite every instinct warning her that she did not belong in a room like this. He had written of memories from their childhood, small details she assumed only she remembered, like the summer they had built a fort from old curtains in the unused east wing, or the winter morning they had skated on the frozen lake until Alexander fell through a thin patch of ice, and Eleanor had pulled him out, with strength she did not know she had. He had written, near the end of the letter, that no matter what changed in his life, he wanted her there to witness this new chapter, because she had witnessed so many of the important ones before. Reading those words, Eleanor had allowed herself to hope, just slightly, that perhaps she still mattered to him in some small but real way. Yet sitting here now, hidden behind cold stone, while the rest of the guests enjoyed clear views of the altar, Eleanor felt that hope shrink into something smaller and more uncertain. She wondered if Alexander even knew where she had been placed, or if this arrangement had happened entirely without his knowledge, buried beneath layers of wedding planners and family politics that he no longer had the power, or perhaps the will, to control. She glanced toward the front of the hall, where a large portrait of Alexander's late father still hung with quiet authority, even now, even on a day meant to celebrate new beginnings. Beatrice, watching Eleanor's expression carefully, spoke again in a low, thoughtful voice. "You know, dear, this family has always had a habit of forgetting who truly matters, until reminded," rather sharply. Eleanor turned to her, surprised by the boldness of the comment, but Beatrice only offered a small, knowing smile, before turning her attention back toward the front of the hall, where the wedding party had begun to gather near a side door. Eleanor felt a strange comfort in those words, though she could not yet understand why, or what Beatrice might know that she herself did not. The music shifted into something slower, more formal, signaling that the ceremony was close to beginning. Guests quieted their conversations, turning expectantly toward the entrance where the bride would soon appear. Eleanor straightened in her seat, trying to catch even a partial glimpse of the altar through the narrow gap beside the pillar. She caught sight of Alexander standing near the front, dressed in a deep charcoal suit, his shoulders set with the practiced composure of a man used to being watched by crowds. Even from this distance, even through the obstruction of cold stone, she recognized the small, familiar tension in his jaw, the same tension he used to carry as a boy, whenever he felt trapped inside expectations, too heavy for him to carry alone. For a brief moment, his gaze swept across the gathered guests, moving row by row as though searching for something, or someone. Eleanor's heart quickened, and she leaned slightly forward, wondering foolishly if he might be looking for her. But the pillar blocked her from his view entirely, and after a moment his gaze moved on, distracted by an official stepping toward him with quiet instructions. Eleanor exhaled slowly, feeling a small, private disappointment settle into her chest, and reminded herself once again that she had not come here expecting to be seen. She had come only to remember and to honor a friendship that had shaped so much of who she had become. The murmurs around her grew quieter still, as the great doors at the back of the hall creaked open, revealing the first glimpse of white lace and soft golden light streaming in from outside. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying herself, unaware that the events of the next hour would unfold in a way she could never have predicted, a way that would soon draw every eye in that grand hall toward the small, hidden corner where she now sat, forgotten behind a pillar of cold marble stone. The great doors opened fully, and a hush spread across the hall like a wave rolling over still water. Every guest turned toward the entrance, necks craning, breaths held, waiting for the first sight of the bride. Eleanor shifted in her seat, trying once again to find an angle around the pillar, but the marble refused to yield even an inch of extra view. She could hear the collective gasp of admiration ripple through the crowd, followed by soft murmurs of approval. Though from her hidden corner, she could only imagine what Charlotte Bellamy looked like walking down that long aisle in her gown. Beatrice, seated beside her, seemed to sense her frustration and leaned in slightly. "You are missing quite a sight, dear. The gown alone must have cost more than most people earn in a year." There was a dry note in her voice, not quite unkind, but carrying a certain skepticism that made Eleanor wonder again what history existed between this calm, sharp woman and the family hosting today's grand event. Eleanor allowed herself a small, polite laugh, grateful for the company, even if the view remained blocked. As the ceremony music swelled, Eleanor closed her eyes briefly and let her mind drift back to a memory from many years earlier, one that felt suddenly more vivid than the muffled sounds surrounding her now. She remembered a rainy afternoon when she was perhaps 11 years old, sitting with young Alexander in the old greenhouse behind the manor, the glass panes fogged with condensation, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and blooming jasmine. Alexander had just returned from his first term at boarding school, and he had looked different somehow, quieter, more guarded, as though something inside him had been folded shut during his months away. She had asked him gently what was wrong, and after a long silence, he confessed that the other boys mocked him for his shyness, for his preference for books over games, for the way he stumbled over his words when nervous. Eleanor remembered how she had simply reached over and taken his hand, not offering advice or empty comfort, but simply staying present with him in his discomfort. "It's all right to be different," she had told him. "Different people notice things other people miss." Alexander had looked at her with such quiet gratitude that day, a look she had carried with her through the years that followed, long after they had grown apart, long after the natural distance of adulthood and social class had settled firmly between them. The memory faded as the music shifted again, and Eleanor realized the ceremony had reached its formal vows. She could hear a clergyman's voice, carrying clearly through the hall, speaking of commitment, loyalty, and lifelong partnership, words that felt both beautiful and strangely hollow to her in this moment, hidden as she was, behind cold stone, while the rest of the world watched the two figures at the altar, exchange promises meant to bind their futures together. Eleanor noticed movement near her table, a young man, dressed in a fitted navy suit, sliding into the seat across from her with an apologetic smile. He introduced himself as Oliver, explaining quickly, in a low whisper, that he was the bride's younger brother, forced to sit at this table because his mother had deemed him, in his own words, insufficiently presentable for the front rows today. There was a wry humor in his tone that Eleanor appreciated immediately, a refreshing contrast to the stiff formality surrounding them. He glanced toward the pillar and shook his head slightly. "Whoever arranged this seating chart clearly has strong opinions about who deserves a view and who does not," he muttered, more to himself than to her, though Eleanor caught the comment and felt a small, uncomfortable knot tighten in her stomach. She wondered, not for the first time, whether Oliver's mother, the formidable Margaret Bellamy, had specifically chosen this obscured corner for Eleanor, and if so, what exactly had prompted such deliberate exclusion. Eleanor had never met Margaret before today, had certainly never done anything to earn her disfavor, yet something about the precision of this seating arrangement suggested intention rather than accident. She thought back to the letter Alexander had sent, the warmth in his words, the sincerity of his invitation, and wondered if perhaps that very warmth had been the problem, if her connection to Alexander's past had been seen as some sort of threat to the polished, carefully curated image of today's celebration. The vows continued, and Eleanor caught fragments of Charlotte's voice through the crowd noise, steady and confident, reciting promises that had likely been rehearsed and refined over many weeks. Eleanor tried to feel happiness for Alexander, tried to push aside the strange ache tightening in her chest, reminding herself firmly that her presence here was meant to honor friendship, not to indulge in old, complicated feelings that had no place in a day belonging to someone else entirely. Beatrice leaned toward her once more, voice barely above a whisper. "You knew him before all this, didn't you? Before the title, before the estate fully passed to him?" Eleanor nodded slowly, surprised again by how perceptive this stranger seemed. Beatrice studied her for a long moment before adding, softly, "He was a good boy. Quiet, but good. It takes a certain kind of person to remain kind after inheriting so much power so young." Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth at those words, grateful to hear someone else speak of Alexander not as a duke or a public figure, but as a person capable of genuine kindness, the very quality that had first drawn her to him so many years ago. The ceremony moved toward its final moments, the clergyman raising his voice slightly as he prepared to pronounce the couple officially married. Eleanor straightened in her seat, trying once more, futilely, to catch a glimpse of the altar, but the pillar remained an unmovable obstacle between her and the moment everyone else in the hall could witness clearly. She heard a wave of applause rise through the crowd, followed by the joyful sound of the string musicians launching into a celebratory piece, signaling that the couple had been officially wed. Guests rose from their seats, some dabbing at happy tears, others clapping enthusiastically, as Alexander and Charlotte turned to face the crowd for the first time as husband and wife. Eleanor rose as well, though her view remained obstructed, catching only fragmented glimpses of white lace and dark suit fabric moving between gaps in the crowd. She clapped along with everyone else, forcing a smile onto her face, determined not to let her disappointment show, especially not to the kind stranger seated beside her who seemed to notice everything. As the newly married couple began their walk back down the aisle, guests reached out to touch their hands, offering congratulations and blessings, the entire hall alive with celebration and warmth. Eleanor watched from her hidden corner, catching only brief flashes of Alexander's face as he passed, his expression composed, polite, the practiced smile of a man performing his role exactly as expected. For one fleeting moment, as he passed near her section of the hall, his eyes flicked briefly toward the pillar, as though sensing something out of place, though the crowd surged forward at that exact instant, blocking any chance of a clear connection between them. Eleanor settled back into her seat as guests began filtering out of the ceremony hall, moving toward the reception area where dinner and dancing awaited. Oliver, still seated across from her, stretched his arms and commented lightly that at least the reception seating could not possibly be worse than this. Eleanor smiled at his attempt at humor, though a small, uneasy feeling had settled deep in her stomach, a quiet worry that perhaps her presence at this celebration had already been noted, judged, and dismissed by someone with far more influence over today's events than she could have anticipated. As she gathered her small clutch purse and prepared to follow the crowd toward the reception hall, Eleanor caught sight of Margaret Bellamy standing near the exit, speaking in low, urgent tones to one of the wedding coordinators, her sharp eyes occasionally flicking toward the guests filing past. For a brief moment, Margaret's gaze landed directly on Eleanor, cold and assessing, before shifting away just as quickly, leaving Eleanor with an unmistakable certainty that her earlier suspicions had been correct. Someone in this powerful family had gone out of their way to ensure she remained hidden today, and as Eleanor stepped through the doorway into the bright afternoon sunlight, she wondered, with a growing sense of unease, whether the true reason behind that decision was about to reveal itself in ways far more significant than a simple matter of seating arrangements. The reception hall glowed with warm amber light, hundreds of candles flickering along long banquet tables draped in ivory linen. Eleanor followed the crowd inside, her eyes adjusting to the soft glow, taking in the sheer scale of the room, easily 3 times the size of the ceremony hall, filled with towering flower arrangements and a string quartet playing gentle background music near a polished dance floor. She held her small clutch tightly against her side, feeling suddenly conspicuous among guests, dressed in silk and fine jewelry, though she reminded herself firmly that appearances mattered far less than the years of genuine friendship that had brought her here today. A coordinator with a clipboard directed guests toward their assigned tables, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with quiet dread as she searched for table 12 once again. To her mild relief, the reception seating placed her closer to the dance floor than the ceremony had allowed, though still positioned near the back of the hall, far from the elevated head table where Alexander and Charlotte would soon sit surrounded by close family. Oliver appeared at her side again, grinning as he pulled out the chair beside her. "Looks like we are stuck together for the evening," he said cheerfully, and Eleanor found herself grateful for his easy, unpretentious company. As guests settled into their seats, Eleanor noticed Beatrice approaching their table as well, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had attended countless grand events and no longer felt the need to rush toward anything. She took the seat on Eleanor's other side, arranging her shawl neatly before addressing Oliver with a warm, familiar smile. "Still causing trouble, I see," she said, and Oliver laughed, explaining that he had specifically requested to sit away from his mother's watchful eye tonight, a comment that made Beatrice chuckle knowingly. Eleanor listened to their easy banter, feeling herself relax slightly for the first time since arriving at the estate. She glanced around the hall, taking in the elegant decorations, the towering ice sculpture near the entrance, the dozens of servers moving efficiently between tables with silver trays. It was hard to reconcile this grand spectacle with her memories of quiet afternoons spent in the modest cottage where she had grown up, just beyond the estate's outer gardens, where her mother had returned each evening after long hours of service to the Ashford family, often too exhausted to do more than prepare a simple supper before falling asleep in her chair. Her mother, Grace Whitmore, had worked as housekeeper for the Ashford household for nearly 2 decades, arriving as a young widow with a small daughter and few other options for supporting herself. Eleanor remembered her mother's tired hands, roughened from years of scrubbing floors and polishing silver, yet always gentle whenever she brushed Eleanor's hair each night before bed. Grace had never complained about her position, had always spoken of the Ashford family with quiet respect, though Eleanor sometimes wondered, even as a child, whether her mother harbored private frustrations about the vast gulf separating their modest life from the wealth surrounding them daily. It was through her mother's work that Eleanor had first come to know young Alexander, initially through brief, distant encounters in hallways and gardens, gradually evolving into genuine friendship as the years passed. Alexander's mother had passed away when he was only 6 years old, leaving him in the care of a stern, emotionally distant father who valued discipline and legacy far more than warmth or affection. Eleanor suspected that Alexander had found in her something he desperately needed, but rarely received at home: a steady, uncomplicated companionship that asked nothing of his title or his family name. A server approached their table, offering a selection of appetizers arranged with delicate precision on small white plates. Eleanor accepted gratefully, grateful for something to occupy her hands as she continued observing the hall around her. Near the head table, she caught sight of Margaret Bellamy again, standing beside her daughter Charlotte, adjusting the train of her gown with quick, efficient movements, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who had successfully orchestrated every detail of an event exactly according to her vision. Beatrice, noticing Eleanor's gaze, leaned in slightly and spoke in a low voice meant only for her ears. "Margaret Bellamy has spent the better part of 2 years planning this wedding, dear. I imagine she considers every guest, every seat, every flower arrangement a reflection of her own success." There was something pointed in Beatrice's tone, an implication that Eleanor's earlier seating placement had not been accidental at all, but rather a deliberate decision made by a woman determined to control every element of how today's celebration would be remembered. Eleanor considered this quietly, turning the thought over in her mind as the appetizer course gave way to soft toasts from various family members. Oliver stood briefly to offer a light-hearted tribute to his sister, drawing warm laughter from the surrounding tables, followed by a more formal speech from an elderly relative who spoke at length about family legacy and tradition. Eleanor listened politely, though her attention kept drifting toward the head table, where Alexander sat beside his new wife, his expression composed and pleasant, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested a quiet weariness beneath the polished surface. She remembered, suddenly, another moment from years earlier, when Alexander had confided in her about the pressure he felt regarding his eventual marriage. They had been perhaps 16 years old, sitting together on the old stone wall overlooking the lake, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold. Alexander had spoken quietly about his father's expectations, the careful lists of suitable families and appropriate matches that had already begun circulating even then, long before Alexander himself had any say in the matter. "I sometimes wonder," he had said, "if I will ever get to choose anything for myself, or if my entire life has already been decided by people who care more about legacy than happiness." Eleanor had not known how to respond to such a heavy admission at the time, and had simply reached over to squeeze his hand, offering silent solidarity rather than empty reassurance. She wondered now, watching him sit beside Charlotte at the head table, performing the role expected of him with practiced grace, whether that same quiet burden still weighed on him, whether this marriage represented genuine happiness or simply another carefully arranged expectation fulfilled. The main course arrived, elegant plates of roasted meat and delicate vegetables arranged with artistic precision, and conversation around the table shifted toward lighter topics. Oliver asked Eleanor questions about her own life, and she answered honestly, though modestly, explaining that she now worked as a teacher in a small village school not far from the estate, a career she had chosen after her mother's passing several years earlier. Beatrice listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering gentle observations about the importance of education, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the easy warmth of these two unexpected companions amid an otherwise intimidating gathering. As dinner continued, Eleanor noticed a change in the atmosphere near the head table. Margaret Bellamy had approached Alexander directly, leaning down to speak quietly near his ear, her expression carrying a subtle tension that seemed at odds with the celebratory mood surrounding them. Alexander's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his brow furrowing slightly, before smoothing back into practiced composure. Eleanor watched this brief exchange with growing curiosity, wondering what private concern could have prompted Margaret to interrupt the celebration in such a manner. Beatrice, following Eleanor's gaze, murmured quietly that Margaret rarely approached anyone during a meal, unless something required immediate attention. Eleanor nodded absently, her thoughts returning once more to the strange seating arrangement that had greeted her earlier that day, wondering if perhaps this private conversation carried some connection to her own presence at the celebration, though she quickly dismissed the thought as overly self-important, reminding herself that she was, after all, merely one guest among hundreds attending this grand occasion. The evening continued, with toasts and laughter, the string quartet eventually giving way to a full band as the dance floor opened for the newlyweds' first dance. Eleanor watched from her seat as Alexander led Charlotte gracefully across the polished floor, the crowd applauding warmly, phones raised to capture the moment. She felt a complicated mixture of emotions watching them together, genuine happiness for Alexander's sake tangled with an old, quiet ache she had long ago learned to keep hidden, even from herself. As the dance concluded, and other couples began joining the newlyweds on the floor, Eleanor noticed Alexander pause near the edge of the dance area, his eyes scanning the crowd with an expression of quiet searching, as though looking for someone specific among the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. For a brief moment, their eyes seemed almost to meet across the crowded hall, though the distance and the shifting crowd made it impossible to know for certain whether he had truly seen her at all. And before Eleanor could process the moment fully, Charlotte's hand found his arm again, pulling his attention back toward a group of approaching guests, eager to offer their congratulations. Long before this evening of candlelight and polished silver, there had been a winter morning that Eleanor would never forget, one that had quietly shaped the entire course of her friendship with Alexander, though few people beyond the two of them ever knew the full truth of what happened that day. She had been 14 years old, and Alexander 15, both of them restless from weeks of being confined indoors by heavy snow that had blanketed the entire estate. When the frozen lake finally seemed solid enough to venture onto, they had slipped away from the watchful eyes of the household staff, eager for a few stolen hours of freedom on the ice. Alexander had always been more confident than cautious, skating ahead with reckless enthusiasm, while Eleanor called out warnings about thin patches near the center of the lake, where the current beneath sometimes kept the ice weaker despite the bitter cold. He had laughed off her concerns, spinning in a wide circle to show off, when suddenly the ice beneath him gave way with a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen landscape. Eleanor remembered the sound with perfect clarity even now, the way it had seemed to freeze her own blood before she forced herself into motion, running and sliding across the ice toward the widening hole where Alexander had disappeared beneath the dark water. She had reached the edge just as his head broke the surface, his face pale with shock, his movements already growing sluggish from the cold. Without pausing to consider the danger to herself, Eleanor had dropped to her stomach on the ice, distributing her weight as her mother had once taught her, and reached both hands toward him, shouting for him to grab hold. His fingers, numb and clumsy, had finally caught her wrists, and she had pulled with every ounce of strength her young body possessed, ice cracking further beneath them both. until finally, he had scrambled far enough onto solid ground for them to crawl together toward the safety of the shore. They had run back to the manor soaked and shivering, and Eleanor's mother had wrapped them both in blankets before the kitchen fire, scolding them gently, while tears of relief streamed down her face. Alexander's father, when informed of the incident, had reacted with cold, controlled anger, more concerned with the scandal such recklessness might cause than with any genuine relief that his son remained unharmed. He had forbidden Alexander from spending unsupervised time near the lake again, though notably, he had said nothing about Eleanor's role in saving his son's life, an omission that had stung Eleanor deeply at the time, though she had said nothing, understanding even then that her place in this household existed at the margins of acknowledgement. But Alexander himself had never forgotten what she had done. In the weeks that followed, he had grown quieter, more thoughtful, often finding excuses to seek her out in the gardens or the kitchen, grateful in ways that words alone could not fully capture. One evening, sitting together beside the fire while Eleanor's mother prepared supper nearby, he had told her plainly that he owed her his life and that he would never forget the courage she had shown that day. Eleanor had brushed off his gratitude with the easy modesty of youth, insisting that anyone would have done the same, though privately she had treasured his words for years afterward, holding them close during the lonelier stretches of her adult life. That bond, forged in ice and fear and quiet heroism, had continued to deepen throughout their teenage years, surviving even the natural distance that grew as Alexander was sent away for extended periods of formal education, first to boarding school and later to university, while Eleanor remained closer to home, eventually pursuing her own education and teaching. Their letters during those years had been frequent and heartfelt, filled with observations about books they were reading, small frustrations about their respective circumstances, and the easy humor that had always characterized their friendship. Eleanor still kept a small wooden box containing every letter Alexander had ever sent her, tucked safely in the bottom drawer of her modest dresser at home. Everything had changed, however, the year Alexander turned 21, when his father's health began declining rapidly, forcing Alexander to return home permanently, to begin learning the full weight of responsibilities that would soon become his alone. Around that same time, Eleanor's own mother had passed away unexpectedly from a sudden illness, leaving Eleanor without the connection to the estate that had previously justified her regular presence there. The natural intimacy of their childhood friendship had gradually given way to more formal, occasional correspondence, though the letters never fully stopped, and whenever their paths crossed at village events or chance encounters, something of their old ease always remained intact, comfortable, and familiar, despite the years and the growing social distance between them. Sitting now at the reception, watching Alexander move through the crowd greeting guests with practiced warmth, Eleanor wondered whether he still remembered that winter morning on the ice, with the same clarity she carried, whether the debt he had once so earnestly declared still held any weight for him, amid the countless other obligations that had since filled his adult life. She wondered, too, whether Margaret Bellamy knew anything about that shared history, or whether her apparent dislike toward Eleanor stemmed from something else entirely, some misunderstanding or perceived threat that Eleanor could not yet fully comprehend. Beatrice, noticing Eleanor's thoughtful silence, asked gently what occupied her thoughts. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before sharing a softened version of the story, omitting certain personal details, but conveying the essential truth of how deeply her history with Alexander ran. Beatrice listened with quiet attention, her expression growing thoughtful, and when Eleanor finished, she reached over and patted her hand gently. "That explains quite a lot, dear," she said simply, though she did not elaborate further, leaving Eleanor curious about what exactly those words implied. Oliver, who had been half listening to their conversation while nursing a glass of wine, chimed in with his own observation. "You know, my mother mentioned something about an old family friend attending today, someone she seemed rather concerned about. I did not think much of it at the time, but perhaps she meant you." Eleanor felt a small chill at these words, confirming what she had already begun to suspect, that Margaret Bellamy had specifically identified her as someone requiring careful management, though the exact reasons remained frustratingly unclear. As the band shifted into a slower song, couples began moving toward the dance floor once more, and Eleanor watched as Alexander excused himself from a group of relatives, his eyes scanning the crowded hall with the same searching expression she had noticed earlier during the ceremony. This time, his gaze moved more deliberately, more purposefully, sweeping across each table with careful attention and Eleanor found herself sitting up straighter, an unexpected flutter of anticipation stirring in her chest, despite her efforts to remain composed. Beatrice, watching this small drama unfold with clear interest, leaned toward Eleanor once more, her voice carrying a note of quiet amusement. "It seems, dear, that someone is looking for you rather intently." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the observation, though she quickly reminded herself not to read too much into a simple glance across a crowded room. Yet even as she tried to dismiss the thought, she could not shake the growing sense that something significant was building beneath the polished surface of this celebration, something that would soon disrupt the careful order Margaret Bellamy had worked so tirelessly to maintain. Alexander moved through the crowd with the careful patience of a man determined not to appear rushed, though his mind had been fixed on one particular concern since the moment the ceremony ended. He had specifically requested, weeks earlier, that Eleanor Whitmore be seated near the front, close enough that she would have a clear view of everything, close enough that he could catch her eye during the quieter moments of the day, and share a private acknowledgement of everything their friendship had meant over the years. Yet throughout the ceremony, he had scanned the front rows repeatedly, finding every expected face except hers, and the absence had settled into his stomach like a stone he could not shake loose. He paused near a cluster of distant cousins, accepting their congratulations with practiced warmth, though his eyes continued sweeping the hall beyond their shoulders, searching the tables further back for any glimpse of pale blue fabric, or the particular way Eleanor tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she felt uncertain in a crowd. He remembered vividly the letter he had sent her, the careful words he had chosen, hoping to convey how much her presence meant to him, without overstepping the boundaries that time and circumstance had placed between them. She had responded with a brief, warm note confirming her attendance, and he had felt genuine relief reading those words, relief that had only grown as the wedding date approached. Excusing himself from the cousins with a polite smile, Alexander made his way toward one of the wedding coordinators standing near the edge of the dance floor, a young woman named Priya who had managed countless logistical details throughout the planning process. He kept his tone light, casual, though something in his posture suggested more urgency than he intended to reveal. "I am trying to locate a guest," he said. "Eleanor Whitmore. I specifically requested she be seated at table 3, near the front." Priya's expression flickered with brief uncertainty before she pulled out a small tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed seating chart. After a moment of searching, her brow furrowed slightly, and she looked up at him with visible discomfort. "It seems there was a change made to the seating arrangement, sir. Table 12, actually, near the back corner." Alexander felt something tighten in his chest at these words, a mixture of confusion and mounting frustration. "I specifically requested table 3, he repeated, keeping his voice measured despite the growing tension building beneath his composed exterior. Priya nodded quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before her. "The change came through about 2 weeks ago, sir. I was told it came from Mrs. Bellamy directly." Alexander absorbed this information silently, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Though years of careful upbringing had taught him to control outward displays of frustration, even when internally he felt something sharp and immediate rising within him. He thanked Priya for her assistance and turned to survey the hall once more, his gaze finally landing on the back corner she had mentioned, where a pillar partially obscured a small table from most vantage points in the room. Even now, from this distance, he could just make out a familiar figure seated there, her posture straight and composed, despite what must have been hours of quiet discomfort at being placed so deliberately out of sight. He felt a wave of something close to anger rise within him, though it was tempered by a deeper, more complicated emotion, something closer to shame at having failed, even unintentionally, to ensure that Eleanor received the treatment she deserved, on a day meant to celebrate connections both old and new. He thought of that winter morning on the frozen lake, the way her small hands had gripped his wrists with unexpected strength, pulling him back from what could easily have been his final moment. He thought of countless other memories woven through their shared childhood, each one reinforcing the same simple truth, that Eleanor Whitmore had never once asked anything of him, had never sought advantage from her connection to his family, and had remained a steady, honest presence throughout years, when so many others around him had proven interested only in his title and his inheritance. Margaret Bellamy appeared at his side almost as though summoned by his thoughts, her expression carrying the particular brightness of someone eager to discuss the evening's success. "Everything is going beautifully, don't you think, Alexander?" She surveyed the room with visible satisfaction, and Alexander studied her for a moment before responding carefully, keeping his tone neutral despite the questions building rapidly in his mind. "I understand there was a change made to the seating arrangements," he said. "Table 3 was meant for a guest named Eleanor Whitmore." Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a brief flicker of something guarded crossing her features, before smoothing back into practiced pleasantness. "Oh, that." Margaret waved a dismissive hand, her tone carrying a note of forced casualness. "I simply thought it made more sense to seat family friends together, rather than scattering guests according to an outdated list." I am sure she understood the logic behind it. Alexander felt his patience thinning at this response, recognizing immediately the careful deflection woven through her words. "Eleanor is not merely a family friend," he said, his voice remaining calm though carrying an edge that Margaret could not fail to notice. "She grew up on this estate. Her mother served this family for nearly 20 years. I specifically requested her presence near the front for good reason." Margaret's composure wavered slightly at this direct response, though she recovered quickly, offering a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "I simply felt it appropriate to prioritize seating for those with more immediate connection to today's celebration," she said carefully, though the implication behind her words was clear enough that Alexander felt a fresh wave of frustration building within him. He understood now, with sudden clarity, that Margaret viewed Eleanor as some sort of complication, perhaps even a threat to the carefully curated image she wished to project of her daughter's marriage into one of the most respected families in the region. He considered his next words carefully, aware that a public confrontation would serve no one well on a day meant for celebration rather than conflict. Yet something within him, something rooted deeply in loyalty and gratitude that had never wavered despite the years and distance separating him from his childhood friend, refused to simply let this matter rest quietly. "I appreciate your efforts in planning today, Margaret," he said finally, his tone polite but firm. "But I would like the original seating arrangement honored. Eleanor's placement should reflect the significance of her role in my life, both past and present." Margaret opened her mouth as though preparing further justification, but something in Alexander's steady gaze seemed to convince her that further argument would prove fruitless. She nodded stiffly, murmuring something about speaking with the coordinators, before excusing herself with visible tension in her shoulders. Alexander watched her retreat across the hall, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and lingering frustration. Though beneath these immediate emotions, a clearer resolve had begun taking shape within him, one that would soon prompt an action, far more dramatic than a simple quiet correction behind the scenes. He glanced once more toward the distant corner where Eleanor remained seated, still unaware of the conversation that had just unfolded on her behalf. He noticed the careful way she held herself, composed and dignified despite what he now understood had been a deliberate slight, and something in that quiet resilience reminded him powerfully of the young girl who had once pulled him from freezing water, without a moment's hesitation for her own safety. He thought of the countless times over the years when she had offered him steady friendship without ever asking for recognition or reward in return, and he felt a growing certainty settle within him that tonight, of all nights, he would ensure she finally received the acknowledgement she had always deserved. Charlotte appeared at his side then, slipping her arm through his with a warm smile, asking softly what had kept him occupied for so long. Alexander hesitated only briefly, before explaining the situation honestly, watching his new wife's expression carefully for any sign of the same defensiveness her mother had displayed. To his quiet relief, Charlotte's brow furrowed with genuine concern rather than irritation. "That seems terribly unfair," she said immediately. "Of course she should be seated properly." Alexander felt a small measure of hope at her response, grateful that whatever complications existed within her mother's calculations, Charlotte herself seemed to possess a fairer, more generous instinct. Together, they moved through the crowd, and Alexander felt the weight of his earlier frustration settling into something more purposeful, a quiet determination building with each step he took toward the far corner of the hall, where Eleanor Whitmore sat waiting, still unaware that the next few minutes would change the entire trajectory of how tonight, and perhaps many days beyond it, would come to be remembered by everyone gathered within these walls. Eleanor noticed the shift in the room before she fully understood its cause, a subtle change in the ambient conversation around her, heads turning slightly, voices dropping into quieter registers, as though something unexpected was unfolding nearby. She glanced up from her plate just as Alexander appeared at the edge of her table, Charlotte beside him, both of them moving with the kind of purposeful attention that immediately drew the notice of nearby guests. Beatrice straightened in her seat, and Oliver set down his wine glass, both of them watching with obvious curiosity as the newly married couple approached. Eleanor rose instinctively, uncertain of proper etiquette in this moment, though Alexander waved a gentle hand, indicating she need not stand on formality. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth that cut through the polite distance she had maintained throughout the day. "I am so glad you came." Eleanor felt her throat tighten slightly at his sincerity, and she managed a small, grateful smile in response. "Thank you for inviting me, Alexander. It's a beautiful wedding." She kept her tone light, determined not to reveal the quiet discomfort she had carried since first discovering her hidden seating arrangement. Charlotte extended her hand warmly, introducing herself with genuine friendliness that immediately put Eleanor at ease. "I have heard wonderful things about you," Charlotte said, her eyes carrying an openness that suggested she meant the words sincerely, rather than as mere social pleasantry. "Alexander has told me about your childhood together, about everything you both went through growing up on this estate." Eleanor felt a flicker of surprise at this admission, uncertain how much detail Alexander had actually shared with his new wife, though Charlotte's warm expression suggested nothing but genuine interest, rather than any hint of jealousy or concern. Alexander's eyes moved briefly toward the pillar behind Eleanor's table, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly, before he addressed her directly again. "I noticed you were seated back here," he said carefully, his tone measured, though carrying an unmistakable edge of frustration beneath the polite surface. "This was not the arrangement I requested." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond without appearing to complain about her treatment on what was, after all, someone else's celebration. "It's all right, Alexander," she said quickly. "I have had lovely company at this table." She gestured toward Beatrice and Oliver, both of whom offered polite nods of acknowledgement. Alexander's expression softened slightly at her gracious response, though something in his eyes suggested he remained unsatisfied with the situation regardless of her attempt to minimize it. "It is not all right," he said firmly, his voice carrying enough conviction that several nearby guests glanced over with visible curiosity. "You should never have been placed here in the first place." Eleanor opened her mouth to offer further reassurance, but Alexander continued before she could speak, his tone shifting into something more decisive. "I would like you seated properly, near the front, where I had originally intended." A ripple of whispered conversation spread through the surrounding tables as guests began noticing the unfolding scene, curious eyes turning toward the small drama building near the back corner of the reception hall. Eleanor felt increasingly self-conscious under this growing attention, aware that whatever Alexander intended next would likely draw significant notice from everyone present. "Please," she said quietly, leaning slightly toward him. "There is no need to make a scene on your wedding day. I am perfectly comfortable here." But even as she spoke these words, she recognized something firm and unwavering in Alexander's expression, a quality she remembered from childhood, whenever he had decided upon a course of action he considered morally necessary, regardless of the social consequences it might carry. Charlotte, watching this exchange with evident understanding, placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm, though rather than urging restraint, she offered quiet encouragement instead. "He is right, Eleanor," she said softly. "This is meant to be a celebration for everyone we care about, and clearly something went wrong with the arrangements. Please, let us correct it properly." Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude toward Charlotte in that moment, recognizing genuine kindness rather than mere obligation behind her words, though she remained uncertain about the wisdom of drawing further attention to what had already become an uncomfortable situation. Alexander turned briefly, catching the attention of a nearby coordinator who had been hovering uncertainly at the edge of the unfolding scene, clearly uncertain how to proceed given the sensitivity of the moment. He spoke quietly, but with unmistakable authority, instructions that Eleanor could not fully hear from her position, though she noticed the coordinator's eyes widen slightly before nodding quickly and hurrying away toward the front of the hall. Eleanor exchanged a worried glance with Beatrice, uncertain what exactly Alexander had just set into motion, though something in his expression suggested this was only the beginning of a larger correction he intended to make. Around the hall, conversation had begun to quiet noticeably, guests at nearby tables straining to catch fragments of what was clearly becoming a significant moment within the evening's proceedings. Margaret Bellamy appeared near the edge of the gathering crowd, her expression carrying visible alarm as she took in the scene unfolding before her. Alexander standing firmly beside Eleanor's table, while several staff members hurried toward the front of the hall, carrying folded linens and additional place settings. "Alexander, what exactly is happening here?" Margaret said, her voice carrying a forced calm that did little to disguise the tension building beneath her carefully composed exterior. Alexander turned to face his new mother-in-law directly, his expression polite but resolute, carrying none of the earlier deference he had shown during their private conversation. "I am correcting an oversight, Margaret," he said simply. "Eleanor Whitmore will be seated at the front of this hall, alongside my family, where she belongs." The words carried clearly enough that several nearby guests exchanged surprised glances, whispered conversations, spreading rapidly through the surrounding tables like ripples across still water. Eleanor felt her heart racing as she absorbed the full weight of what was unfolding around her, uncertain whether to feel grateful for Alexander's loyalty or mortified by the growing attention now focused directly upon her. She glanced toward Beatrice, seeking some measure of reassurance, and found the older woman watching the scene with an expression of quiet satisfaction rather than concern, as though something long anticipated had finally arrived. Oliver, meanwhile, had leaned back in his chair with visible amusement, clearly enjoying the unexpected drama unfolding before him despite his sister's obvious embarrassment. Margaret's composure finally cracked slightly, her voice rising with barely restrained frustration.
"Alexander, this is entirely unnecessary."
"We can discuss seating arrangements privately, after the celebration concludes." Alexander shook his head firmly, his expression carrying none of the hesitation he might have shown in earlier years, when navigating conflicts with authority figures accustomed to having their decisions unquestioned. "This has already waited long enough," he said simply, and with that, he turned back toward Eleanor, extending his hand with quiet, unwavering determination. "Please, Eleanor, allow me to correct this properly." Eleanor hesitated only a moment longer, feeling the weight of dozens of curious eyes now fixed upon their small corner of the hall, before finally accepting his offered hand, rising slowly from her seat as the surrounding room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to see exactly what remarkable correction Alexander intended to make on this, his wedding day, in full view of everyone gathered to witness it. What happened next would be discussed among the guests for weeks afterward, retold at dinner parties and family gatherings, with varying degrees of embellishment, though those who witnessed it firsthand would insist the truth needed no exaggeration at all. Alexander, still holding Eleanor's hand gently, turned to address the small team of staff members who had gathered near the edge of the hall awaiting his instructions. "Move this entire table," he said clearly, his voice carrying easily across the now hushed reception hall. "Table and all, to the front of the room, beside my family's table. Every place setting, every chair, exactly as it stands now." For a moment, the staff exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unaccustomed to such an unusual request, though the coordinator who had spoken with Alexander earlier stepped forward quickly, nodding with sudden understanding, before directing her team into action. 4 staff members moved toward the small round table, where Eleanor had spent the entire ceremony and reception, hidden behind cold marble stone, carefully lifting it, linens and all, while 2 others gathered the chairs belonging to Eleanor, Beatrice, and Oliver, following close behind, as the small procession made its way across the polished floor, toward the front of the grand hall. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, watching this remarkable scene unfold, scarcely able to believe what was happening around her. Every eye in the reception hall had turned toward the spectacle, conversation dying away entirely, as guests rose slightly from their seats, to better observe the unprecedented sight of an entire table being relocated in the middle of a wedding celebration. Someone near the back of the hall began to clap softly, a single pair of hands at first, followed quickly by others joining in, until a wave of applause spread through the room, guests clearly moved by the unmistakable gesture of loyalty and respect unfolding before them. Alexander guided Eleanor gently by the arm as they followed the table toward its new position at the front of the hall, directly beside the elevated head table, where Alexander's closest family members sat watching, with a mixture of surprise and evident approval. Beatrice and Oliver trailed behind, both wearing expressions of barely contained delight at the remarkable turn of events, Oliver in particular struggling to suppress a grin as he glanced back toward his mother, whose face had gone rigid with poorly disguised shock. The staff arranged the table carefully in its new position, smoothing the linen and adjusting the place settings with practiced efficiency, while Alexander pulled out Eleanor's chair personally, an act of simple courtesy that nonetheless carried enormous symbolic weight, given everything that had just transpired. Eleanor lowered herself into the seat slowly, feeling the warmth of the applause still echoing around the hall, her cheeks flushed with a complicated mixture of embarrassment and quiet, overwhelming gratitude. Alexander straightened and addressed the room briefly, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided the entire remarkable sequence of events. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to acknowledge someone whose friendship has meant more to me over the years than perhaps I have ever properly expressed. Eleanor Whitmore grew up alongside me on this very estate, and there is no one whose presence here today matters more to me, beyond my own family, than hers. I am sorry that an oversight kept her from the recognition she deserved earlier today, and I wanted to correct that properly, in front of everyone gathered here to celebrate with us." A fresh wave of applause rose through the hall, warmer and more sustained than before, and Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity and public generosity of Alexander's words. Charlotte, seated now beside her husband at the head table, reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand warmly, her expression carrying genuine happiness, rather than any hint of resentment at the attention her husband had chosen to direct elsewhere during their own celebration. Eleanor felt profound relief at this quiet reassurance, grateful that whatever tension had existed earlier between Charlotte's family and herself, the bride herself harbored no such feelings. Near the back of the hall, Margaret Bellamy remained standing rigidly where she had witnessed the entire sequence unfold, her expression carrying a mixture of humiliation and barely restrained anger. Several nearby guests cast curious glances in her direction, clearly drawing their own conclusions about who bore responsibility for the earlier seating arrangement that had prompted such a dramatic correction. Eleanor noticed the older woman's discomfort and felt an unexpected pang of sympathy despite everything, understanding that public embarrassment, regardless of whether it was deserved, rarely felt pleasant for anyone experiencing it. The band, sensing the natural conclusion of this remarkable moment, began playing again softly, gradually easing the room back into a more comfortable celebratory atmosphere, as guests slowly returned to their conversations and their meals, though the energy in the hall had shifted noticeably, charged now with the kind of story that would be retold for years to come. Beatrice, settling into her new seat beside Eleanor at the front table, leaned over with a warm smile.
"Well, dear,"
she said quietly.
"it seems your friend has quite a memory for old debts."
Eleanor laughed softly despite herself, wiping at the corner of her eye with a napkin, still processing the whirlwind of emotion that had swept through her over the past several minutes. She glanced toward Alexander, who had returned to his seat beside Charlotte, though his eyes met hers briefly across the table, carrying a warmth and quiet satisfaction that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed. Eleanor offered him a small, grateful smile in return, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly, a tension she had carried since childhood finally beginning to ease. Oliver, seated once more beside her, leaned in with an amused whisper. "I have never seen my mother's face go quite that particular shade of red before," he said, and Eleanor could not help but laugh again, grateful for his light-hearted presence amid the emotional intensity of the past several minutes. Around them, the reception continued, guests returning to their meals and conversations, though occasional glances still drifted toward Eleanor's newly positioned table, curious eyes lingering with obvious interest in the woman who had so unexpectedly become the center of the evening's most memorable moment. As the initial shock of the scene began to settle, Eleanor found herself reflecting on everything that had just transpired, still somewhat overwhelmed by the public nature of Alexander's gesture, though beneath that lingering discomfort, a quiet, steady warmth had begun to take root. A recognition that perhaps the friendship she had treasured so deeply, for so many years, had never faded from Alexander's own heart either, despite the passage of time, despite the vast differences in their circumstances, despite everything that might have naturally separated two people whose lives had diverged so dramatically since their shared childhood on this very estate. By the time dessert was served, the reception had settled into a more relaxed rhythm, though the earlier events continued to ripple through quiet conversations at nearly every table in the hall. Eleanor caught fragments of hushed discussions as she passed guests on her way to the ladies' powder room, snippets of admiration, mixed with curious speculation about her exact history with the newly married Duke. She kept her expression composed, offering polite smiles whenever caught in someone's gaze, though the attention remained genuinely uncomfortable despite the warmth behind most of it. Inside the powder room, she found herself unexpectedly face to face with Margaret Bellamy, who stood before an ornate mirror adjusting her earrings with visibly unsteady hands. Their eyes met briefly in the reflection, and for a moment neither woman spoke, the air between them heavy with everything that had transpired over the past hour. Eleanor considered simply excusing herself quietly, unwilling to prolong an already difficult situation, but something in Margaret's expression, a flicker of genuine distress beneath her carefully maintained composure, gave her pause. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said finally, her voice quieter than Eleanor had heard it all day, stripped of the sharp authority she had displayed throughout the planning and execution of the wedding. Eleanor turned to face her fully, uncertain how to respond, and Margaret continued before she could speak. "I am sure my reasons will sound foolish now, but I was concerned, when I learned of your history with Alexander, that guests might draw the wrong conclusions about his marriage to my daughter. I worried about whispers, about people wondering whether Charlotte was truly his choice, or merely a convenient match arranged by circumstance." Eleanor felt a wave of surprised understanding wash over her at this admission, recognizing suddenly the anxious, protective instinct that had likely driven Margaret's earlier decisions, however misguided their execution had been. "I understand wanting to protect your daughter," Eleanor said gently, choosing her words with care. "But Margaret, Alexander loves Charlotte. Anyone watching them today can see that clearly. My friendship with him belongs to an entirely different chapter of his life, one that has nothing to do with the choice he made in marrying your daughter." Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly at these words, though her expression still carried visible embarrassment. "I handled the situation poorly," she admitted. "I should have simply spoken with Alexander directly, rather than trying to manage things quietly on my own. Instead, I have embarrassed myself in front of everyone whose opinion matters most to this family." Eleanor felt a genuine pang of sympathy at this admission, recognizing the particular vulnerability beneath Margaret's polished exterior, a mother simply trying, however clumsily, to protect her daughter's happiness on the most important day of her life. "Perhaps we could start again," Eleanor offered carefully. "I have no interest in causing tension within your family, Margaret. I only ever wanted to honor a friendship that has meant a great deal to me over many years." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, before finally nodding slowly. "I would appreciate that," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time since Eleanor had encountered her that day. "Perhaps I judged you too quickly, based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge of who you are." The two women exchanged a tentative, understanding smile, before returning separately to the reception hall, though Eleanor felt considerably lighter having addressed the tension directly, rather than allowing it to fester unspoken for the remainder of the evening. As she made her way back toward her table, she encountered Charlotte near the edge of the dance floor, who immediately reached for her hand with evident warmth. "I heard you and my mother spoke," Charlotte said softly. "Thank you for being gracious with her. She has always struggled with wanting everything to appear perfect, sometimes at the expense of handling things with proper care." Eleanor smiled reassuringly, appreciating Charlotte's honest acknowledgement of her mother's flaws without excusing them entirely. "Your mother clearly loves you very much," Eleanor said. "That kind of protective instinct, however imperfectly expressed, comes from genuine care." Charlotte nodded, her expression grateful, before glancing toward where Alexander stood, chatting animatedly, with a group of his university friends near the bar. "He speaks of you often, you know," Charlotte said quietly, her tone carrying no jealousy, only genuine curiosity. "Even before we were engaged, whenever conversation turned toward his childhood, your name always came up eventually." Eleanor felt a complicated warmth at this admission, uncertain exactly how to respond, though Charlotte continued before she needed to find words. "I am glad he has someone like you in his life," she said simply. "Someone who knew him before all of this, before the title and the responsibilities and the constant public attention. It must be a rare and valuable thing, having a friend who remembers who you were before the world decided who you had to become." Eleanor found herself deeply moved by the generosity of this observation, recognizing in Charlotte a quality of genuine emotional maturity that suggested Alexander had, indeed, chosen his life partner wisely. As the evening progressed, Eleanor noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in how other guests approached her, no longer with cautious curiosity, but with genuine warmth and interest. Several introducing themselves and expressing admiration for the loyalty Alexander had displayed earlier. An elderly gentleman, introducing himself as a longtime family friend, commented that he had known Alexander's father for decades and had rarely witnessed the kind of quiet integrity Alexander had shown that afternoon, a trait he suspected had been sorely lacking in the previous generation of Ashford men. Beatrice, rejoining Eleanor at their table with a fresh glass of champagne, observed the changing atmosphere with quiet satisfaction. "It seems, dear, that you have made quite an impression today, entirely without intending to," she said, her eyes twinkling with gentle amusement. Eleanor laughed softly, still somewhat overwhelmed by the events of the past few hours, though beneath her lingering embarrassment, a genuine sense of belonging had begun to settle within her. Unlike anything she had experienced since her mother's passing years earlier, had severed her formal connection to this grand estate. As dessert plates were cleared and the band shifted into livelier music, encouraging more guests onto the dance floor, Eleanor found herself finally able to relax fully into the celebration, no longer burdened by the quiet anxiety that had shadowed her throughout the earlier hours of the day. She watched Alexander laughing freely with his friends, occasionally glancing toward her table with warm, easy affection, and she felt a profound gratitude settle within her, not merely for the dramatic gesture he had made on her behalf, but for the simple, enduring truth that their friendship, forged so many years ago in childhood innocence, had proven resilient enough to survive every challenge time and circumstance had placed before it. As the night wore on and the dance floor filled with laughing couples, Alexander found a quiet moment to slip away from the celebration, making his way toward the terrace doors that opened onto the estate's expansive gardens, now lit softly by strings of small lights woven through the surrounding trees. He found Eleanor there, standing near the stone balustrade, gazing out over the darkened lawn toward the lake that had played such a significant role in their shared history. She turned as he approached, offering a warm, slightly tired smile. "I hope you do not mind me stealing a moment away from your own celebration," she said gently, and Alexander shook his head, moving to stand beside her at the railing. "I needed a breath of fresh air myself," he admitted. Weddings, it turns out, are rather exhausting affairs, despite how much joy surrounds them. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant music from the reception hall drifting softly through the cool evening air, mingling with the quiet sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. "I owe you an explanation," Alexander said finally, breaking the silence with quiet sincerity. "For what happened earlier, and honestly, for so much more than that." Eleanor turned to face him fully, curious about what exactly he meant to share. He continued, his voice carrying the same thoughtful quality she remembered from their childhood conversations beside the fire. "When I received word that you would attend today, it meant more to me than I think I properly conveyed in my letter. You have always been one of the few genuine constants in my life, Eleanor, someone who never wanted anything from me beyond honest friendship." Eleanor felt her throat tighten slightly at these words, moved by the vulnerability behind them. "You saved my life once, quite literally," he continued, "and I have never forgotten that debt, though I suspect you have spent years trying to convince yourself it does not matter." Eleanor opened her mouth to offer her usual modest deflection, but Alexander held up a gentle hand, asking silently for the chance to finish his thought. "It matters to me," he said firmly, "perhaps more than almost anything else in my life. And when I learned you had been pushed aside today, hidden away as though your presence somehow threatened the image of this celebration, I could not simply let that stand unaddressed." Eleanor nodded slowly, absorbing his words with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for what you did today," she said softly, "though I confess, I never expected such a public gesture. A part of me wished the ground might simply open and swallow me whole in that moment." Alexander laughed gently at this admission, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I imagine it was rather overwhelming," he acknowledged, "but I wanted everyone in that hall to understand clearly how much your friendship has meant throughout my life, particularly during years when so few people around me seemed interested in anything beyond my title and my prospects." They fell into a comfortable silence again, both gazing out over the moonlit lawn, memories of childhood summers spent exploring every corner of this estate, passing quietly between them, without need for words. "I have often wondered," Alexander said eventually, his voice carrying a note of careful reflection. What my life might have looked like if circumstances had been different. If the natural distances of class and expectation had not gradually pulled us into such separate worlds. Eleanor felt her heart quicken slightly at this admission, uncertain exactly what he intended to convey, though she sensed the weight of unspoken history hovering between them. I think, she said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate honesty, that we were always meant to remain important to each other, regardless of the particular shape that importance took. Perhaps not in the way either of us might have imagined as children, but meaningful nonetheless. Alexander turned to look at her fully then, something warm and genuine passing across his expression. You have always had a gift for finding the right words, he said quietly. Even when we were children, you always seemed to understand things I struggled to articulate myself. Charlotte deserves someone who chooses her fully and completely, Eleanor added gently, wanting to ensure there was no ambiguity in her meaning, however tender the conversation had become. And from everything I have witnessed today, it is clear you have chosen well. She is kind and genuine, and she clearly adores you. Alexander nodded slowly, a soft smile touching his features. She is remarkable, he agreed, and I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that both of you are part of my life now, in whatever ways that friendship continues to take shape. Eleanor felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her at these words, understanding fully now that whatever complicated feelings had lingered from her childhood affection for Alexander had found their proper resolution, transformed not into romantic longing, but into something equally valuable, a deep, enduring friendship that had weathered years of distance and would likely continue weathering whatever challenges the future might bring. Perhaps, she thought, this had always been the truer shape of what existed between them, something steadier and more resilient than fleeting romantic passion. A bond built on genuine loyalty and shared history, rather than temporary infatuation. Alexander glanced back toward the reception hall, where warm light and laughter continued spilling out into the evening air. I should return to my guests, he said reluctantly, though his tone suggested genuine warmth for their private conversation rather than eagerness to end it. Eleanor nodded in agreement, and they turned together to walk back toward the terrace doors. Before they re-entered the celebration, Alexander paused, turning to face her one final time. Thank you for everything, Eleanor, he said simply. For that morning on the ice so many years ago, for every letter and every conversation since, and for having the grace to forgive an old friend for a mistake that was never truly his to begin with. Eleanor reached out and squeezed his hand warmly, feeling the full weight of years of friendship pass silently between them in that simple gesture. There is nothing to forgive, she said softly. I would not change a single moment of our history together, not even the difficult ones. And with that, they returned together to the warm glow of the celebration, ready to rejoin a night that had already, in its own unexpected way, become far more memorable than either of them could have anticipated when the day first began. The wedding celebration continued late into the night, guests dancing beneath the twinkling lights strung through the garden trees, laughter and music carrying across the estate grounds in a way that felt, to Eleanor, entirely fitting for the joyful occasion it had ultimately become. She spent the remaining hours seated comfortably at the front table, no longer hidden behind cold stone, but surrounded instead by warm conversation and genuine connection, watching Alexander and Charlotte share their final dance of the evening with visible tenderness and affection. As the celebration began winding down, guests slowly departing in pairs and small groups, Margaret Bellamy approached Eleanor once more, this time with an entirely different demeanor than the tense, guarded woman who had orchestrated the earlier seating arrangement. She extended a genuine invitation for Eleanor to visit again soon, perhaps for a quieter family dinner, where they might become properly acquainted, without the pressures and anxieties of a grand public celebration weighing upon their interactions. Eleanor accepted warmly, sensing real sincerity behind the offer, and feeling grateful that whatever misunderstanding had colored their earlier encounter had given way to something more hopeful and genuine. Oliver, before departing with a group of friends toward the estate's guest accommodations, made Eleanor promise to stay in touch, only half joking when he suggested she might make an excellent addition to future family gatherings, given how thoroughly she had managed to upend his mother's carefully controlled plans within a single afternoon. Eleanor laughed at this, promising to remain in contact, genuinely fond of the easy warmth he had offered throughout what could otherwise have been an isolating day. Beatrice, gathering her shawl as she prepared to depart, took Eleanor's hands warmly in her own, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a story reach its proper, deserved conclusion. "I have known this family for many years, dear," she said quietly, "and I must say, today reminded me why some bonds, however unlikely they might appear to outside observers, prove far stronger and more meaningful than the more conventional connections society tends to celebrate." She squeezed Eleanor's hands gently before making her way toward the exit, leaving Eleanor with a warm, lingering sense of having gained not only clarity about her own history, but genuine new friendships as well. As the final guests departed and the reception hall grew quiet, staff beginning the careful process of clearing decorations and folding linens, Alexander found Eleanor once more near the entrance, offering to arrange transportation back to her cottage, rather than allowing her to make the journey alone so late into the evening. She accepted gratefully, and as they walked together toward the waiting car, Alexander spoke quietly about hopes for the future, mentioning plans to establish a scholarship fund in his mother's memory, one intended to support children from working families within the local community, ensuring they received access to quality education, regardless of their family's financial circumstances. "I would love your involvement, if you are willing," he said, glancing toward her with genuine hope in his expression. "You understand better than anyone what such an opportunity might mean to families like your own growing up." Eleanor felt a swell of purpose and excitement at this proposal, recognizing immediately the meaningful legacy such a project might create, one that would allow their friendship to continue evolving in a direction that honored both their shared history and their individual commitments to community and education. "Of course," she said warmly. "I would be honored to help however I can." Alexander smiled, visibly pleased by her enthusiasm, and they spent several more minutes discussing initial ideas before the waiting car pulled up to carry Eleanor home. Before she departed, Alexander embraced her warmly, a gesture that carried none of the awkwardness that might have accompanied such a moment years earlier, but instead reflected the comfortable, settled affection of two people who had finally found clarity about the true, enduring nature of their bond. As the car pulled away from the grand estate, Eleanor glanced back at the illuminated windows of Ashford Manor, thinking of everything the day had brought, from the quiet humiliation of being hidden behind a cold pillar, to the remarkable, public gesture of loyalty that had followed, and finally, to the warm, honest conversation that had settled so many old, unspoken questions between herself and Alexander. She felt profound gratitude for how the day had unfolded, recognizing that sometimes the most meaningful chapters of a story begin not with grand declarations, but with quiet moments of genuine kindness extended between people who had never stopped caring for one another, regardless of how far life's circumstances had carried them apart. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself increasingly involved in the early planning stages of the scholarship program, working alongside Alexander to identify families within the community who would benefit most from the opportunity. Drawing on her own experience as both a former resident of the estate grounds and a dedicated teacher, deeply familiar with the educational challenges facing working families in the region, Charlotte, too, became actively involved in the initiative, and the three of them developed a genuine, easy friendship that continued strengthening in the months that followed, built upon mutual respect and shared purpose, rather than any lingering complications from the past. Margaret Bellamy, true to her word, extended several invitations for quiet family dinners, and gradually, Eleanor found herself welcomed into the broader circle of the Ashford and Bellamy families, no longer viewed as an awkward remnant of Alexander's past, but recognized instead as a valued friend whose history with the family carried genuine importance and meaning. The story of the wedding and the remarkable moment when an entire table had been moved across a crowded reception hall became something of a cherished local legend, retold with warmth rather than scandal, a testament to loyalty and integrity that many in the community came to admire deeply. Eleanor often thought back to that afternoon when she had first arrived at the grand estate, uncertain and anxious, seated behind a cold marble pillar where she believed she might remain hidden and forgotten for the duration of the celebration. She realized, looking back, that the discomfort of that moment had ultimately given way to something far more valuable than mere social acknowledgement, a renewed and deepened friendship that would continue shaping both her own life and the lives of countless children who would benefit from the scholarship program born from that remarkable day. And though the pillar had once stood between her and a clear view of the wedding she had come to celebrate, she understood now that no obstacle, however solid or deliberately placed, could ever truly diminish the genuine bonds of loyalty and care that had connected her to Alexander since the earliest days of their shared childhood, bonds that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any barrier standing in their way.